it was around 1994, 1995 when I met him. At that time, I'd not long left a violent marriage, taking with me my daughter, who was about 4 or 5 then. And he knew about my earlier problems when he entered into a relationship with me. I was in my late 30s when we met. He was round about 30. In 1997, a marriage took place. This was following a period of imprisonment, during which I wrote to him almost every day to keep his spirits up, because he led me to believe that he was seriously depressed and he was on suicide watch. He told me that his jail term, which wasn't a long one, related to an old offence from his youth when he was ill-advisedly involved with a car crime organisation in London. He was very convincing, and his parents appeared to support his story. So all in all, I had no reason to disbelieve him, and I actually felt sorry for him. I still don't know the truth about that. I didn't actually obtain a divorce from him until much later. It was 2003, 2004, when our relationship, such as it was, broke down completely. And this was because over the year or so leading up to the split, I had found out the truth about what I now know to be his autogynephile paraphilia. I tried to find him online. I tried to contact people that knew him. My solicitor managed to find someone who served the papers on him, and the divorce was straightforward. When I talk about this, I always feel as if people might think that I was a fool to be taken in. But I can't emphasize enough how he knowingly and deliberately turned my kindness and my sympathetic nature against me. I tried to be understanding, bent over backwards to be supportive, even to the extent of alienating my friends and family members, who I suppose now in retrospect could see some of the things about his nature that I couldn't. And they tried to warn me against him, but his hold over me was such that I couldn't see it. And I told myself, you married this man in sickness and in health, and I had to try and stick by him. I tried talking to him to see if we could thrash things out ourselves, but he wouldn't talk. Later on, as things degenerated, he would gaslight me by saying that I was the one that was the source of the problem, that I was emotionally unstable and a bit mad. All the time this was happening, I was continuing to perform my role as head of a large English faculty at a comprehensive school, and also trying to make sure that my daughter's life was a happy one. In the end, though, the strain on me was just too much. I became diagnosed with, eventually, ME, and had to cease work. From the outset, it wasn't an easy marriage. He was not emotionally engaged and present person that I'd known before I married him. He almost changed overnight. He was out late most nights, usually with a work-related pretext, and he used my home like a hotel, coming in late, leaving early. His excuse for that was that he was building up his businesses, but he was emotionally absent most of the time. And the excuses about his depression began early. My father suffered with bouts of depression, so it was easy for me to relate to this. But I pleaded with my ex-husband to seek medical help, go to the doctor, see someone who might be able to help you with this problem, but he wouldn't. I eventually realized that he wasn't even registered with a general practitioner. He wouldn't even go to the doctor for a physical ailment. His depressions would cover anything from not wanting to do anything at Christmas to not wanting to go out with me, with friends to have something to eat, to just disappearing for a week at a time. Not always a week, sometimes just 2 or 3 days, but the worst case was a week. And it was quite regular. It wasn't just once in a blue moon. He would always say afterwards it was his depressive illness, or, how I am. And he would say he was doing it to spare me the distress of being with him when he was like this. That rang rather hollow in my ears at the time, because it wasn't exactly a picnic. I worried constantly. I would drive around looking for him sometimes. I can't have any real faith in any explanation that he ever gave me about anything. All the things he told me about his businesses, I think, were not true. I mean, he had a car business, he had a second-hand book business. He once told me that his father had depressive illness and that it was related to his father being an embezzler, and that he'd embezzled money from a company that he used to work for. Now, when he told me this story, I had no reason to disbelieve him, and we didn't have that much to do with his parents. So I just let that lie. But now I don't know whether that's true or not. His attitude to money, to me, was very strange, because I don't come from a wealthy background, and I've worked hard for any money that's passed through my hands. And so I found it very difficult to understand his attitude to money initially. When I met him, he didn't have anything at all. I had a house and a respectable position as a senior teacher in the town. And I think that's what drew him to me, especially the latter. I think that he wanted cover. He wanted someone who would make him look respectable. So he would behave to me as though he was ploughing back his money into his business ventures so that we could be more stable in the future. And I had obviously been running the house before he came on the scene, so I just continued to do that. At the time, I suppose I looked at it as another way in which I was supporting him through what I perceived to be a difficult period in his life. But later on, as time moved along, he was quite flamboyant in his spending. He would spend a lot on clothes for himself. He loved shopping. He did give me gifts, usually jewelry, often in the wake of some kind of incident or bad behavior or absence that obviously made me unhappy. I thought, well, this is expensive gift. He obviously must care for me at some level. He doesn't mean to treat me badly. It wasn't until much later that I found out that he was actually, I suppose the term is offence. People used to bring things that they'd stolen or shoplifted to him, and he would take them off their hands for a small sum. In the very early days of our association, he tried to persuade me to do things like having sex in public places, outside in fields and by roads, where people might go past. And even though at that time, you know, I wanted to please him, I just I couldn't hack that. And he backed off. And I thought at the time that that was out of respect for my feelings. But what I discovered via some of the photographs that I've subsequently found was that he was just doing it with other people. I believe with my whole heart that my husband had an addiction to risk and to being center stage. A long history of involvement in crime, periods, quite lengthy periods, as I understand it, of being wanted by the police. He told me once that that was the reason he turned up in my town in the first place, that he was keeping a low profile, and he came to an area where he thought no one would look for him. That and the risks of being dressed in women's clothing in a public place, which I know he engaged in. In the case of being sexually active in public, he later on he boasted about it, and was quite scathing of me for thinking that this was something that probably he shouldn't be doing. I think he thought that I was a killjoy or a prude. He used to tell stories about women that he'd been with before. It made it clear that these were women who were also in some way vulnerable. They often had children, and he would also say that she was a drunk. I have no doubt that when he moved on to the next woman, which he did, I know that he's been in relationships with other women since then, he probably said the same things about me. When we split up, he told everybody that knew us in the area at that time that the reason our marriage had ended was because I'd been having serial affairs. And because he was so convincing and such a good guy, people believed it. It took years before I was able to undo the impact of those lies that he told about me. I think that all these things were part of that. The idea of standing up and telling stories and entertaining people, which he did many, many times in all kinds of situations. He would tell a true story in such a way as to make people believe that he was joking, that it was all a fiction. And he would tell an untrue story in such a way as to make it sound like the absolute God's honest truth. And he would mix the two so that he could have a group of people, and he did the same thing to me on a smaller scale, so that in the end, you didn't know what was true and what was performance. But people knew that he was entertaining and that he was charismatic and that he was well-dressed. And so he was quite popular. He didn't have close friends, but he had a lot of people who thought he was a good guy. Some of the offences that he has been involved in a criminal way were offences that would come under the heading of confidence tricks and fraud. He wasn't a rough and tough sort of physical crime criminal. He was a con man, and he was a very good one. He needed all those things. He needed the attention. He needed to be able to demonstrate that he could put something over on people. And he needed to be in a risky situation where there was always the chance that he could get caught. But he didn't get caught. This was the climax of a long period of increasing strain on me. There had been, by that time, so many unexplained phone calls. People phoning up and asking for a feminized version of his name. And when I answered the phone and said, "This is Mrs.," they would just hang up. He never, ever left his mobile phone anywhere where I might see it or have access to it. And he went to some considerable trouble for that. I'd spent weeks looking at his movements. I really did turn detective, and comparing his movements with what he said he was doing. I did have access to his car, so I even checked his mileage, and I managed to work out he couldn't possibly have gone where he said he'd gone because the mileage didn't match. I did all kinds of things to try and find out what was really going on, because I knew there was something. On this one day, this was during the period where I'd stopped teaching, and he wanted to buy a pub. We had a pub and a restaurant. He got bored with it in the end and stopped being there very much. Even though I had ME, I was ill, so ill that I couldn't do my teaching job. Somehow I had to keep that pub and restaurant running. And I did that. I did that in total for 2 years, the worst 2 years of my life. I was completely exhausted at the end of it. This time he was working behind the bar one Monday night because that was my only night off. I was eating my meal. I was very unhappy, pushing food around my plate, when suddenly, and I cannot explain how or why this happened, it was like an epiphany. I suddenly realized that the answer to all the things that were troubling me were in a certain building that he had described to me as a small, scruffy storage area. So I stole his keys and I drove down to what I believed was this sort of scruffy little storage area, and I let myself in. And that was when I found there was a nice comfortable bed. There was means of having a hot drink and cooking a small meal, microwave and everything. So immediately I realized that this was where he'd been disappearing to. He hadn't been sort of roaming the countryside at all, been holed up here. There were lights set up as though filming was going to happen any moment. Racks of clothes, all quite expensive, but of a trashy kind. Wigs, makeup, thousands and thousands of photographs. I just had the breath knocked out of me at that time. I couldn't at first take it all in. Everything that I thought I knew about my life was undercut by this scene, and that my whole marriage was a lie. And then I suppose reality kicked in, and I thought, oh, he may come after me. You know, I got quite frightened then. So I opened the boot of my car, loaded in as much of the stuff as I could get in the boot as evidence. I suppose I must have been thinking about divorce. And I drove to my parents' home where I stashed my evidence. So by the time I came back to the pub, it was getting late, but it wasn't late enough for the pub to be closed. He knew by that time where I'd been, and that, he would know what I'd found. I took a seat at the bar myself and drank a couple of brandies, waiting for him to close. Just looked at him. As soon as I started to speak, he dissolved into tears and immediately turned it round so that I'm supposed to be the one that was sorry for him. I took his tears, I think, as an indication that he was genuinely sorry and that he wouldn't do this again. So it was only after the crying had stopped and I'd been comforting him that it became apparent that that's not what he meant at all. And at one stage, he tried to tell me that he'd told me about it and that I must have known. but it's indicative of the lengths that he would go to wrong foot you, as it were. That evening, and indeed the day that followed, became all about him. My anger was somehow turned into sympathy for him, struggling with this dreadful secret. Even I, now thinking about it, find it difficult to see how he did that. But that's what happened. And in fact, I very briefly entertained some thoughts about how I could live with what he was doing. Now that sounds really mad, doesn't it? And it is. But I think what was happening in my head was I couldn't face the fact that everything about my life was going to be blown open. And so I desperately looked for ways of making it manageable, making it workable. And that didn't last very long. In a way, I'm glad that happened, because it enables me to realize how it is that some women who find themselves living with severe orthogyneophiles do stay in the relationship. I think that I can understand how it's so terrible to contemplate the loss of everything at once, that you might be tempted to say, all right, well, I'm going to go along with this and salvage what I can. And I don't think I would have understood that if I hadn't have had that brief reaction myself. For a little while, I allowed myself to be manipulated into feeling sorry for him, to discussing how we could incorporate this whole outrage into our relationship. I'm sure that a lot of women feel the same way. And some of those women will be the ones that you see with men who are quite clearly AGP. And you see the men smiling and happy and triumphant, and their wives or girlfriends, brittle smiles and flat eyes. And anyone who's been in that situation can know that they're not really happy with it. They're just going along with it. Although we did have a sex life, I had always felt that there was some barrier in terms of what to me is intimacy. I increasingly over time felt that his sexual activity with me was a kind of performance, and that he would never really look at me. He never really looked at my face or my eyes. And after I'd learned about this, the hurt and the sense of being excluded from what should be an intimate act that I felt as a result of those moments clarified in my mind as he wasn't really with me at all. He would turn his face away, he would close his eyes, and I believe that's because he was actually imagining some kind of scenario that's related to this, and he wasn't really with me in any real sense. And that damaged my self-esteem in a way that it took me many years to overcome. You can tell that even after a quarter of a century, it still hurts. This is what I believe is the most pernicious thing about autogynephilia, that it actually mitigates against any kind of emotional intimacy, any real intimacy. And if If men impose their autogynephilia on women and expect those women to engage in sexual acts with them, that what they're actually doing is a cruel act beyond any emotional cruelty that I can imagine, because to me, and I'm sure to lots of women, a sexual connection, a really intimate sexual connection, is almost a religious experience. And he made that shabby. When I found out the truth about it all, he admitted that it was something that he'd done all his life, when he used his sister's underwear for masturbatory purposes. And he went on to specifically say that over time it became linked with his association with pornography. At the beginning of our relationship, technology was only just beginning to be used in schools, and he was very, very quick on the uptake. He was very techno-minded right from the off. He did have everything that was technologically available at that time. He had in those premises. He'd spent a lot of money. He had lights, he had editing equipment, he had lots of stuff there that I wouldn't really understand what it did. Although the technology wasn't what it was today, that he was making the videos and distributing copies. Practically all my friends were turned against me or dropped me, because it was all too difficult. I had one friend who stuck by me. Sadly, she's no longer with us. And so she came to the pub and she celebrated my birthday with me. And she left quite late in the evening. And my ex-husband then volunteered to walk her home. It was not very far, but it was dark and it was quite late. And when he came back, he tried to sell me a story that she'd made a sexual overture to him. It was a last-ditch effort to try and separate me from my very best friend. She told me what he'd said to her, which made it clear that he had been deliberately trying to sow discord between us, because he was deliberately trying to isolate me. At the very end, the only support I had really was my mother. My mother had difficulty maintaining a pregnancy, and she had 2 or 3 miscarriages. When she was pregnant with me, she had a series of injections with a drug that was in widespread use at the time, which did indeed help her retain the pregnancy, her and many, many other women. But it's now known that there are inherent risks to women who were conceived and carried by women that had had this drug. And they include an increased risk of cancer, some risk of infertility, and a tendency to miscarry themselves. I'd already had a miscarriage earlier in my life. I'd had my daughter. It was a difficult pregnancy, and I had to have a lot of bed rest during it. I had a lot of anxiety around, the whole being pregnant, health issues. I'd had a cancer scare when I had to have some laser treatment for precancerous cells. So there's a lot going on there. But I did fall pregnant. And he was very pleased, made a great fuss of me. It was a nice little interlude. And although I had anxieties, obviously, given these issues, I was pleased because he was pleased. he hadn't changed his behavior very much. He was still going out a great deal, and leaving me behind. But on this one occasion, he invited me to go with him to an auction that he was attending. I actually suffered a spasm of pain while we were standing in the middle of this auction. And I had to go to the ladies' room. And I was there for quite a while. I clearly had miscarried. There was evidence of it. I was frightened, bit, shocked, in some discomfort. I wanted to go home, but he wouldn't leave the auction. And he never referred to it really after that. I was just kind of left to get on with it myself. I realised that it sounds awful, but it's probably the best thing that could have happened, because how I would have coped with what was to come if I'd have had 2 children to think about, I just don't know. I think he just had no capacity to care about it. It was like as if he'd initially fallen in love with the scenario of having a wife who was having a baby, and he was going to be a father again, because he already had children that he'd left behind, much, much earlier relationship. But then when that didn't happen, it was as if he just drew a line under it and left it there. For him, that was it, end of story. And he didn't really have any regard for how I might be feeling about it at all. My ex-husband was very good at making me feel that I was at fault. And I carried that past the end of the relationship for a long time. I don't feel that now. I feel that he was profoundly at fault, but that maybe he was in the grip of something that he wasn't really able to control. And if that was the case, then I can, up to a point, forgive him. What I can't forgive him for is entering into the relationship in the first place, because he knew and he did it anyway. I thought at one stage I had swallowed his presentation of events, and at one stage I thought that there must be some failing in me, that I must not have been attractive enough or supportive enough, and I certainly, by the end of it, I didn't have a shred of self-esteem left. But bit by bit, I fought back from that and began to see things differently. And I started to speak out. And I have been so much abused by people who have attacked me online for no other offense, really, than citing my own personal experience. And I think this is so funny, really, when so much attention is given to the lived experience of certain people, but the lived experience of women like me is dismissed as lies, bigotry, fantasy, bitterness. I'm just a bitter old woman. I've been told that I should keep my views to myself because I'll be dead soon anyway. If I had been in the middle of what I was going through and someone said to me, I want you to go on camera and talk about it, I wouldn't have been able to do that. I was too demoralized. I was too emotional. I was humiliated. And I still feel some of that humiliation. But I'm not in the middle of it. And I have opted to speak out because I can. Because 20 odd years have passed, and I've had time to come to terms with what happened to me. If people choose to be horrible to me and to insult me and call me names, then so be it. I will not be silent about it, not for my sake. Damage is done to my life now, but for the sake of women everywhere who are being silenced on this subject, who are being abused and made to feel that their experience is irrelevant or is motivated by nastiness or bitterness. I'm speaking out for those people. It seems like the right thing to do. There is hope for anyone out there who's in a similar situation. It took me a while, but I have rebuilt my life. I've even more or less recovered from my ME, which a lot of people will tell you can't be done. The main thing that helped me was writing. I've always liked to write, scribbling, and I found that really therapeutic. I began to deal with my past. I improved enough to be able to do a qualification in creative writing with the Open University 2-year course, and that was in 2007, 2008. And since then, I've been writing and submitting work regularly, poetry and short fiction. Eventually, I met another man who I was able to trust enough to form another relationship, and I'm even married again now. So I am happy as anybody is in the wake of the dreadful things that are happening in the world at the moment. I'm as happy as anyone else, in spite of all that has befallen me. So I've got a list of questions that I would ask. Do they really believe that biological sex is a spectrum and that it's possible to change one's sex? Or are they accepting the notion that you can change your sex on a whim out of fear? Or are they accepting it out of commercial expediency? Are they accepting a view that's been foisted on them by a vociferous but highly motivated minority because it's easier to do that? I would ask them, have they examined the robustness of the studies that are so often quoted by activists? Do they really believe that the previously liberal and left-wing women who are now leaving their former political parties in droves are doing that because they have turned overnight into bigots and haters and harpies? Or could it be that these politically intelligent and active women see a threat to the rights and protections of women and have determined to act to do something about it? And then I would ask them, do they know anything at all about autogynephile men and the problems that they pose to the privacy, the dignity, and the safety of women and children? And finally, although there are other questions, the one that sits at the heart of this sorry state of affairs for me is just this: why are they not listening to the voices of women? Why?